I do want to share my screen. Again. Okay. The American hazelnut tree, Corylus americana, is a shrub that produces gorgeous lime-colored leaves that blaze into a deep crimson with neon orange fringe, adorable flowers called catkins, and of course, delicious nuts curled up in charming ruffled packages. I think the phrase hazelnut catkins might be my favorite phrase in the English language. It's so cute. Anyway, it's a delightful and resilient little tree. And if you want to see them in their multi-season glory, you can actually find a collection of them growing along the northern wall in the garden at Prospect Gardens Park on 110th in Morgan Park. And Philip and I and Hazel have two saplings. They are native to Chicago and common throughout much of the eastern North America. So these glorious shrubs were found growing somewhere unexpected in 2017 in the middle of a Canadian conifer forest, part of a handful of pockets of thriving biodiversity. In addition to the hazelnuts, a variety of medicinal and edible plants supported seed-eating insects, insect-eating birds, and a vast range of species connected around the food web. I'm sure you can guess what ethnobotanist Chelsea Heralda Armstrong confirmed when she was invited to study this surprising landscape. Dr. Armstrong observed that this was no pristine, untouched wilderness at all, but a human-created, regenerative, ecological system. Cultivated by indigenous people, these ancient forest gardens continued to flourish for more than 100 years after their gardeners fell to disease, land theft, and cultural erasure wrought by European colonial invasion. In the absence of their founding gardeners, the forest gardens grew and thrived, their biodiversity and resilience significantly greater than that produced by modern conservation efforts, and even greater than so-called pristine or untouched natural landscapes. Imposing European formal garden design through utter subjugation of existing wildlife on North American stolen lands completely expired. Despair at the horror wrought on the landscape by human intervention, leading to feelings of futility and shame, tired. Centering indigenous science and leadership in forestry and agricultural practices, and discovering ways that human beings can restore that landscape, wired. One way to look at the story of the forest garden story is that a different world is possible. And maybe a better way is that a different world has always been possible and can be again. The writer Mukwapani, in reflecting on the response of her yarrow in her California garden as wildfires raged, urges us to, and now I begin to read her writings, recognize our more than human kin as central characters in their own stories rather than victims in ours. Do we really want to continue the narrative of the Anthropocene, where we frame humans as the failed caretakers of the earth and use the quality of our own survival as the key measuring stick of planetary health? However true some parts of this Anthropocenic narrative might be, it's one that inspires despair and guarantees overwhelm. For a moment, I center the entire universe around the yarrow being in my garden. They are native to these lands where seawater and forest smoke have mingled in the air for millennia. I celebrate their resilience and I dream of a landscape inspired by their wisdom, one where humankind reframes the weight of our impact as potentiality rather than doom, one where we lay our soft bellies on the soil and ask the spiders what they want. One where in place of hierarchies of anthropic saviorism, we engage in networks of interspecies aid. So what story do you want to tell? My story began before we moved to Beverly, when I lived in Logan Square and Philip in Humboldt Park, and I used to run in the morning through the paths and gardens in Humboldt Park. I don't run that far anymore. At that time, I would not have called myself a naturalist, but I began to notice something that converted me, or someone, many someones. Remarkably, in the middle of this large, developed industrial city, I would encounter so much wildlife, particularly in the section of the park dedicated to native plants, much more than the fancy formal garden at the south end of the park, and I began to get curious, inhaling the minty, earthy scent of Monarda mingled with coneflowers and big blue stem as bees hummed around me. Who are you? I visited in all seasons and observed the scenes change and began to get excited when learning the names of plants and insects and birds who visited and recognizing them anew. When I encountered them on hikes elsewhere, the more names I learned, the more plants I encountered that I didn't know, the more I wanted to learn. I began to notice and recognize individual species, and the thrill of discovery, of recognition, of one life acknowledging another was like the surprise of running into a dear friend while traveling abroad. When we bought our first home and moved here to Beverly, I planted a 10-square-foot garden of pollinator magnets. And when we joined BUC, I won in the service auction a course in monarch midwifery from Pat Haynes. So I also credit her with some of my love of gardening. And as my garden grew, both the plants themselves and in surface area, as I converted more of our lawn to restored, or what we hope will be prairie, my regard for plant and insect intelligence and my affection for each being grew too. So what began as a small plot designed really to engage my own human senses has grown into a sprawling, unwieldy, and delightfully untidy outdoor living room to multiple new visitors, fluttering and crawling insects, birds, and new offspring of my tiny plot's first flowers. I love it. I'm just going to share with you a couple of a slide that has just a few of the friends who come to visit. Thank you for your patience. These photos were all taken with my iPhone in my garden. I can't believe it. To me, native plant stewardship represents a form of restorative justice, one where instead of seeking victory over nature, we seek its restoration. Instead of a victory garden, a justice garden. Gardeners across North America have begun to defy conventional lawn maintenance and ignore HOA stipulations, eliminate dangerous leaf blowers, and stop applying toxins, removing lawn grass and invasive ground covers, and slowly begin replacing them with uniquely beautiful, tall-growing native species. Our messy but exuberant garden contrasts the finely manicured, tightly bordered private property. And I stuck a Monarch way station sign in front, just so you know this is intentional. But native plantings need not be unruly like mine. Any native garden is an affirmative alternative to shallow-rooted, close-cropped carpets of Euro-engineered monocultural lawn that needs chemical applications. A protest against the displacement of the indigenous living legacy of our region, against the subjugation of nature to a Eurocentric aesthetic. On their way to displacing indigenous people, plants, and animals of our region, colonizing settlers moving west met the tallgrass prairie that existed right where we stand or sit today. And what kind of land did they meet? Giant grasses and skyscraping forbs, leggy, long-necked sunflowers and broad multi-flower umbels, some towering over horse and rider in broad and tall swaths of bold purple and bright yellows, fuzzed out seed heads sending their offspring floating, and enormous blue stem grasses with their constellations of spikelets and roots that stretched even deeper below ground than the stems above ground, and the wide prairie disappearing into a horizon of oak savannas and slow rivers crossing an absolutely flat topography that allowed the wind to barrel forcefully in all directions. Anybody can love the mountains, wrote Willa Cather famously, but it takes a soul to love the prairie. And indeed, seeing nothing special particularly about a bunch of overgrown grasses and spindly yellow flowers, and discovering the extremely valuable soil built up by glacial movement, bison, insects, plants, fungi over millions of years, and then carefully stewarded for thousands of years by native tribes, colonizers destroyed 99.9% of it in the span of about 50 years. The prairie all but vanished, subdivided into industrial plots of corn and soy for livestock, dense urban spaces sadly bereft of greenery, doesn't have to be that way, by the way, suburban carpets of imported grasses that require chemical maintenance, split by high-speed roads and poisoned by exhaust and agricultural runoff. Today, just 1% of 1% of the original tallgrass prairie survives. It is the single rarest biome in North America and one of the most endangered in the world. Truly, the remnants and restorations of our prairie are so special. William Least Heatmoon, American travel writer and historian of English, Irish, and Osage ancestry, writes in his book, Travelogue Prairie Earth, it's a very thick volume, but it's beautiful, a deep map. Whatever else prairie is, grass, sky, wind, it is most of all a paradigm of infinity. A clearing full of many things except boundaries, and its power comes from its apparent limitlessness. There is hope for the prairie, for you and the other animals who make it their home. Unlike largely ineffective individual acts like single stream recycling, you can make an actual difference. You can actually see the difference. You can experience and enjoy the difference. Native plantings, even in small settings like home gardens, even in small corners of home gardens, can actually increase bird biodiversity in a region. Not only that, the roots of native plants reach much deeper than those of lawn grass, improving soil and water quality. And like our oceans and forests, healthy prairies can mitigate the climate crisis if we just let them. Prairie plants stretch their roots 15 feet or more into the ground, sequestering and storing more carbon underground than a forest can store above ground. Just grasses. Once established, native plantings require less maintenance than introduced exotics, which, like creeping Charlie or bishop scoutweed, can escape cultivation and run rampant with no insects adapted to feed on them. Prairie plants that are integral to the ecosystem can't compete, and introduced plants can become invasive and require dangerous chemical treatments to contain that do further harm. But we can mitigate the harm right now in our lifetimes by replacing exotics with native species, beginning the work of restoring the balance between soil, plant, and animal that was here long before any human beings, the balance that built the rich prairie biome, our home. This morning, my garden, yours, all of our gardens are beginning to awaken from their dormant winter stage, which is why I chose this date to share my journey with you and an earlier version of this sermon 2 years ago. Much of it has changed. Like so many, I have lived with depression through most of my life, which returns in waves as seasons move through me and bring memories of loss. Eco-anxiety and eco-grief settle in and bring feelings of pernicious hopelessness. But I experience a noticeable increase in endorphins and serotonin working in my garden. I get a jolt of dopamine at the first sight of early shoots and blooms, a feeling of well-being when I smell the familiar aroma of plant nectars and soil mingling on a warm, late summer afternoon. I feel curiosity and kinship watching a caterpillar chomping a leaf, butterflies and bees chasing each other from stem to stem. And at the end of the season, I see overwintering and migratory birds alike, enjoying a seedhead buffet of dried joe pie, goldenrod, asters, echinacea, blazing stars, rattlesnake master, hysops, and all manner of creatures who rely on the food and shelter provided by even a small patch of native plantings and leaves left to curl and decompose. I gain winter inspiration from the stark prairie stem standing defiant in the wind and snow. I want to show you just a quick, if you'll indulge me. This is some of the winter interest I talked about. So cool. So much better than just clearing everything out at the end of the season in fall. It's better to be just lazy and let it be, because animals enjoy it. I love knowing that the hollow stems will become homes for solitary nesting native bees who co-evolved with these plants. And in the Justice Garden, we're not victors in a war with harsh nature, but we're students of those beings who have made intimate peace with a living world. To face the climate crisis with the courage and creativity we will need, we must overcome our eco-anxieties, our fear of climate change, and our shame over the human planet so that we can actually act. We need to cultivate our own resilience and incorporate non-human intelligences. What can one person do? And better, what can we all do together? A multicultural interspecies alliance. We can cultivate justice by voting, by direct social and political activism in favor of anti-racist, bold climate policy. We can select native plants by reputable sources committed to preservation and organic growing methods. And in the fall, we can just leave the leaves for insects. We can cultivate our own internal awareness by opening all of our senses to the non-human stories and victories all around us. Together, we can tell a better story of creativity and interdependence.